to another edition of The Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics who write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. And currently, I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. And today, instead of my usual business attire, I'm wearing a Philadelphia Eagles football jersey because it's Halloween here in Vietnam as well. Today, my guest is Eduardo Briceño. Did I say that right?
Yeah, Briceño, yes.
Author of the book, The Performance Paradox, Turning the Power of Mindset into Action. Eduardo, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here.
And I really like this book because this is kind of stuff I actually talk about here in Asia and speak at corporations about this kind of thing. And this is what we're teaching our students as well. So it's just a pleasure to have you on. So as we're starting, I'd like you to tell us about your professional background and how you got to where you're at right now.
Sure. Whereas a bunch of unexpected turns. I grew up in Caracas, Venezuela. I always thought of myself as much more comfortable with numbers than with words. And I ended up studying chemical engineering and finance in Penn, where you have taught. And I then went on to work in investment banking in New York City and then in venture capital in Silicon Valley. And after 7 years of doing that, I realized I had been my whole life just doing what society expected of me, just trying to get good grades, trying to find jobs that gave me what I thought of like as hard skills and that would give me job security because I had seen kind of economic instability in Venezuela, but I hadn't like developed any interest, anything that I was really passionate about. And I had just followed kind of what society expected and what high paying jobs would be. And I wasn't really into it. I wasn't feeling like my life, my work was making a difference in somebody else's life. And I came to that realization because I got physically sick. I got a repetitive strain injury that was very intense. I started losing the ability to use my hands. It was very painful to use the mouse or the keyboard or to brush my teeth or open doors. And I was getting worse, and I met people with the same condition who couldn't use their hands for more than 10 minutes a day. So I had to prioritize my health. But then I also realized, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I feel like my life will not have had any meaning. And I didn't want to feel that way. So I went to grad school, interested in social entrepreneurship and also education. My wife had become a teacher, and I had seen that she had really found her purpose and that had made a big difference in her. And I wanted something like that for myself. And so I went to grad school, and there I was introduced to a professor by the name of Carol Dweck, who had done some amazing work on mindset, growth mindset and fixed mindset. And I learned about her work. I realized how a fixed mindset had been, something that had gotten in the way of my goals and my life. And she wanted to get mindset out into the world and to educate people about it. People hadn't heard about it at all at the time. And so we co-founded an organization called Mindset Works. I was the CEO for 10 years. She was on my board. And over time, part of my job became to evangelize growth mindset and to do lots of keynotes and public speaking, which I ended up really enjoying, which was surprising to me because I grew up very, very introverted, and I didn't think I would be good or enjoy, public speaking, but I did. I loved getting into the psychology, getting into the work, getting into the conversations. And so eventually that became my full-time job. And I then started working a lot with businesses that wanted to foster a culture of learning. And that's what I do now. I partner with organizations that are transforming their culture to help them bring ideas and strategies that are especially leadership strategies into how to foster cultures of learning.
What did the illness teach you? And how did that affect you as a leader yourself?
It taught me so much. I mean, one thing that it taught me is that sometimes when we're in the middle of the tempest, it feels like the worst thing that could be happening. I was 27 years old. I was, at the risk of becoming disabled. How I was going to make an income for the rest of my life, and it felt like a horrible thing. But I ended up so much in a so much better place, doing work that I love, but also leading a much healthier life. I learned about nutrition and sleep and exercise and holding my body and all kinds of things, purpose. And I am in such a better place now than I would have been if I hadn't gone through that crisis. Um, and so that was, one lesson. But through the whole journey, I reflected on what I wanted my life to be, what I valued, and how to pursue it. And that was, probably the biggest lesson is just gaining clarity on what I value and how to go about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't take the time to sit there and think about what all this means because and life goes by in a blink, right? I mean, you probably how old are you now?
I just 4 days ago turned 50.
Right? And you still think you're like 25.
Yeah, I feel good.
So let's start about the book. In chapter one, The Performance Paradox, you describe how focusing too much on performance can actually undermine improvement. What moment or experience first made you recognize this paradox in your own life?
Sure. Well, recognizing this paradox in my own life took many, many years because I was stuck in this flywheel or in this kind of hamster wheel, right? Of just executing and following and just working hard. And I didn't see it for a very long time. How I recognized that was through years of working with, Carol and, learning from people like Anders Ericsson at Florida State University, who was an expert in deliberate practice, and others, and trying, in holding workshops with executives on how to foster more improvement in their organizations. And eventually I realized that in order to improve, we must be deliberate about improvement. And, I realized when I was in venture capital, a lot of the times, the entrepreneurial pitches or what we were talking about is people who could execute, and just we just talked about execution, and execution is not bad at all, but it can confuse people into thinking that all we need to do is to execute and to execute as much as possible. And what I realized is that if we are just working hard, trying to do things as best as we know how, trying to minimize mistakes, we stagnate, right? If we are always performing, our performance suffers, because in order to improve our skills and improve our performance, we have to do something other than perform. And so once I saw that, then I could see it in my whole life, in my school, in my investment banking days, in my venture capital days, and still, like whatever, my marriage, my hobbies, because if I'm just doing the activity as much as possible, that's not the way to improve on the activity.
Why do you think so many high achievers equate constant performance with success rather than growth?
Well, I mean, I think that we are not taught in school that um, in order to improve our success and our results, we have to do something other than perform. Even when I was, say, for example, playing sports in school, when I would go to practice, I would just try to perform as best as I could, right? So, if you are, say, you play soccer and you're, in defense, you're going to try the best you can during the games to avoid mistakes and to play as best as you can. But in practice, you might want to do something else, right? If your right foot is your strong one, you might work with your left foot to make that better, or you might play as a forward a little bit to empathize more with the defender, with a forward that you're playing against. So you might do other skills and drills and activities, and sometimes we would do those things, but I wouldn't know how. I wouldn't know why we were doing those things, and so I wasn't understanding the difference in what we need to do to improve than to perform. And so then we get into work, and part of the, as you know, part of the human cognitive bias that we have is a kind of present bias. We overvalue the present and undervalue the future. And so if we are overvaluing the present, the way to maximize our immediate performance and our current performance is through the performance zone, right? Say that you are a salesperson, and maybe it makes sense to like unpack the performance zone and the learning zone a little bit more. So if you think about, for example, you're playing a match of tennis, right? And it's a really important game. You might if you're having trouble with a particular move, you might avoid that move during that match because your sole goal is to win that trophy, right? But then after the match, you go to your coach and you say, Coach, I was having trouble with that move. I was avoiding it. Now let's focus on that. Let's work on that move. Let's figure out how to get better at it. And that's a very different activity than what we do when we're performing, right? When we're trying to win. And sometimes what we do is we're just trying to win all the time. We're trying to perform all the time. That stagnates us. And so one of the reasons is the performance zone is the way to maximize immediate performance. So if you're a salesperson and you are in the last week of the quarter, it might make sense if you're close to quota to just focus on performing that week and just making sales and try and making phone calls and trying to close deals if that's your most important goal that week. But the problem is if we're doing that all the time every week, then we don't discover better strategies and better ways to really change our game and improve our game. And so I think there's part of psychology, human psychology. Part of, we're not taught this. Part of it is the systems in society. Like for example, the stock market values present earnings, and so CEOs and executives have a lot of pressure to deliver on present earnings, and that leads them to cascade down performance, chronic performance down the organization. And then that becomes part of the culture of how we lead and how we work, right? It's just to go try to do things as best as you can without making any mistakes, without realizing that that's actually decreasing our performance.
Did you have this insight when you were a venture capitalist, or did it happen after, or did being a VC give you insights into this?
I did not have this insight when I was in VC. It was afterwards. And then looking back in my VC days, I could see a lot of this infiltrated into VC, right? I mean, we were not clear enough. And I was working with a firm that has like $3 billion under management. It was one of the largest firms in the world. And so for me, for example, I was the youngest professional there. And after entrepreneurial team, after a startup would pitch to us, we would all go around sharing our views and our opinions of the startup. And I noticed that everybody would state a view with a lot of confidence and being sure of themselves. And so I emulated that. And even though, they had decades of experience more than me, they had a lot more formed opinions than I did, and they could be a lot more confident. But I felt that in order to belong, like I had to be sure. And so I was completely unsure, but I would pick a side and then just like argue, like as if it was in high school, right? And we're even taught to do this in high school. In high school, we are taught to go into the debate teams and just like make your point and like not say kind of what you're uncertain about, what your questions are. Just try to present yourself to be sure of yourself. And so that was a dynamic that was happening there. Or, in boards, sometimes I saw board of directors, board members kind of putting a lot of pressure on the company to just figure it out and get success right now, and it's just about, hey, just deliver right now. And I think there was not enough clarity on, hey, we need to explore and test and experiment in order to figure it out.
How can individuals recognize when they are stuck in the performance zone without realizing it? And explain what the performance zone is as you describe it.
Sure. So the performance zone, one way to figure out if we're stuck in the performance zone is if we are constantly just, our only goal is to get things done as best as we know how, trying to minimize errors. So we're just trying to get things done all the time. That's a clue that we are in the performance zone all the time. Because if we want to leap into the learning zone is when we leap beyond the known, when we're trying new ways of doing things that might or might not work, right? That's what's needed in order to improve continuously and to innovate. And so when we are in the learning zone, we are trying something that might or might not work. We have a hypothesis that we are testing. We are asking questions. We're going beyond what we know or what we think we know. And so sometimes we can do both at the same time in what I call learning while doing. So that means we're doing things not only with the goal of getting them done, but also with the goal of improving along the way. So we might be getting things done, but trying something we haven't tried before to see if that's a way to do it better. Um, and so that is definitely one big clue is like, what is your goal? Are you deliberate about what you're trying to improve and how you're going about that improvement?
In chapter 2, the tournament and the range. In the tournament, and I'm putting quotation marks, tournament versus range metaphor. How does competition help or hinder learning?
Well, competition can help or hinder learning, like you're saying. Um, where it can help is, for example, if we look at great athletes who competed with each other, they inspired each other to work really hard in the learning zone, in practice, in trying to change their swing or their techniques to be able to beat each other, right? And so they are increasing the performance standards, and that can be an inspiration and motivation for us to work hard in the learning zone to figure out how to always continue to improve. And that's where competition can be helpful. But in most contexts, competition, especially internal competition in an organization, is detrimental to learning, right? Because when we are competing with other people in the organization and seeing them as other rather than it's the same team, then we're withholding information from them. We might be kind of sabotaging them without like wanting to or with wanting to. Rather than in collaboration, we are sharing information, we are sharing feedback with each other, we're sharing ideas with each other. We might be in a meeting together and then debrief afterwards as to, hey, what did you observe? What did I observe? What could I do differently? And the collaboration helps us both in the learning zone and in the performance zone. So it helps us learn better and perform better because more brains are smarter than one brain, especially if those brains are diverse and have different experiences and different viewpoints. So in
Um,
general,
you
in a growth mindset tends to foster more collaboration, which is the opposite of competition. But competition in some instances can help us figure out how to continue to raise our performance. But for that, we need to engage in the learning zone.
Yeah, I remember the CEOs back in the, let's say, 80 or early 90s, 80s, and before would like to pit people against each other in an organization with the strongest surviving and rising to the top. But now, don't CEOs recognize that that's detrimental to the success of the organization?
I think so. What do you think? What do you observe?
I think so. I mean, when I came on at Vin University and I took over their hackathon and I asked them, what's the purpose of the hackathon? And they said to see how much stress the freshmen could handle. I said, CEOs are spending a lot of money to figure out how to de-stress their companies so people perform at a higher level. I said, no study shows that people perform at a higher level when they're under a lot of stress and pressure. It's very few people who can do that. So how does that make any sense to you? Where's the learning in that, right?
Absolutely, and I think hackathons can be a great structure, but for the goal of innovating and collaborating across functions and coming up with ideas, and if you are actually trying to stress people, a stressful mental state is not conducive to creativity and innovation. So that's just really funny.
Yeah, I thought it was just, I told them that we weren't going to go in a gym, have them sleep on the floor 24 hours with some theme that we're going after. We were going to go solve the 8 biggest problems in Vietnam. And we had 240 students, 24 teams of 10. And then we reduced those teams till we had 8 teams of 30, and they focused on how do you go and solve the 8 biggest problems that Vietnam faced. And the students, at first they were resistant to it, but as they got into it, they realized they were learning what it was like to work with larger groups, and they were focused on a problem that could make a difference for everybody in the country. And I think that's what people want to do is they want to feel like their lives meant something, like you did, and they want to make a real contribution, and money is secondary to the contribution.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. That's cool.
So, you write about broadening one's range. What practical steps can someone in a highly specialized field to take to avoid narrowing their growth? And especially now that AI is predicted to take almost over every job. I just read where Bill Gates said almost every job will be, and same with Elon Musk. They said within days of each other that AI would be taking over every position. I think it's going to be damaging, but I don't know it's going to take over every position. So, what's your advice in this area to people?
Well, I think people can each person decide on their strategy around their development of their expertise. And so, for example, you can think of your expertise as an I, as a vertical line, which is like very specialized and deep in one thing. That's one strategy. Another one would be like a dash, right? Just complete generalist across the board. Or you might think about something like a pie, right? Where you have two different specializations. You might be a chef and like a chemical engineer, and then learn about a lot of other different things at a shallow level, and then uh, 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 mixing chemical engineering and chef expertise might lead to really cool innovation and performance and contribution to society. Or you might add a third or a fourth area where you go deep. But it is, and I think that there isn't one answer. Like, people can be specialists and they can be generalists. I personally like being, going deep on a couple of areas and learning about a lot of different things broadly. But there is definitely research that is very compelling, that shows that there's a lot of value in learning about a couple of different areas, because for one thing, innovation often happens from connecting what was previously disconnected. And so sometimes we can connect that in our own brain when we're showering, or going for a walk. Then some of those connections happen. Or sometimes it's when people come together and people with different expertise, different functions share ideas. You can create magic by bringing in some insights or ideas from one domain and applying them and combining them with something from a different domain. And that's what I personally love the most, is to, I'm super curious. I love to learn about things I don't know about. And I find a lot of value in that kind of range, that breadth. And a great book on that topic is Range by David Epstein. Talks about the value of developing generalist expertise.
How can leaders create safe range environments that encourage exploration without reducing accountability? I think a lot of people are afraid to take some risk because they're afraid that they won't be supported in the risk, and that could be detrimental. What's
Sure.
your advice about for leaders creating a safe range environments?
Sure. So here, just to be clear, the word range means something a little bit different than what we were just talking about. So the chapter that this is on is called "The Tournament and the Range." And the range, you might think about like a golf range, right? Where you go to the range to work on your swing. And so you might, try different ways of swinging, or different clubs for different purposes. And you might practice deliberately in order to improve. Versus in the golf course, or in the tournament, you're trying the best club for a situation with the best swing that you know to use. And that's the performance zone. And the range is the learning zone. And so how can leaders create safe range in their organizations? Is how can they create clarity around what are the times and spaces to engage in the learning zone, and how do we do that? And that's a really important question to align on. And the answer is going to be different by organization, by function, by team. But so, for example, if you're in a sales team and you're going to go in, a couple of you are going to go into a meeting with an important client, maybe like it's a big client, high stakes client, you might align on, hey, in this conversation, we're going to be in our performance zone. This is going to be the golf course, not the range. And we're going to go with the person who can best communicate this, who's had to have successes in the past. The rest of us, we're going to debrief later and learn from that, all of us. But this is not a time to experiment, to try new things that may or may not work. Or you might go into a client meeting and say, hey, we're going to experiment with a different approach here. We're going to try to bring music into this because we know this client really is into music, and see if that it helps the conversation and the relationship. And it might or may not work, but we're going to learn from it. Um, and so that clarity of so generally when the stakes are very high, you want to avoid mistakes. So you want to do things as best as you know how. You want to try to be on the performance zone as much as possible. There might be ways to do kind of micro experiments that are not risky, and that's ideal, right? Where we are trying something new, even if it's not a big thing. But then it's important to think about, how do we learn more about our customers to be more customer centric? How do we experiment more? How do we solicit and give each other feedback more? What do we do, in the middle and at the end of our project processes to debrief on how we're working together and what we can do to better collaborate? And those are all times and spaces, those are all ranges to engage in the learning zone. And those are great conversations to have as a team to align on.
I'm venture capital has a very, very incredibly low hit rate. 2,000 companies look at, invest in 10, one's a hit, it's like 1 out of 2,000. The funds that actually even return the capital to their investors, the original capital, is only like 34% actually do that. What could they learn from what you've just talked about that would help increase their success rate in the investments that they make?
Well, I think that in my perspective, I think that venture capital has improved on this a lot over the last couple of decades. I think when the book The Lean Startup by Eric Ries came up, and it became a big, framework that a lot of startups would use, and venture capitalists would then kind of learn about and promote. I think that, and before that, it was customer development. The 4 steps to the epiphany was a book that was a predecessor to that one. Um,
Yeah.
but I do think, and then like Andy Radcliffe and the kind of product market fit. So like this idea that we need to find the right product and the right market, and the right product market fit, and it involves a lot of experimentation and iteration and customer development work, and just a lot of hypotheses and testing those hypotheses. I think that the entrepreneurial industry and the venture capital industry have improved a ton on that over the last couple. Though that's all about engaging in the learning zone. Um, and so that's my impression. It's become a lot more learning oriented. But you're in this world. What do you think? What are your impressions, Mark?
I think I'm trying to figure out. I got a grant to start. I asked the president, could I start a unicorn launch pad? And I'm studying, why is their hit rate still incredibly low? What are they
Mhm.
really not doing well? Because they come from the best schools, they have the smartest minds. When you meet them, they're incredible people. But what is it that's really missing here? That and venture capitalists, like when I started, I'm 64. When I started, VCs were actually investing in early stage companies with no revenue outside of biotech and pharmaceutical. They would be willing to do it. Now they've, in a sense, reduced their risk by investing in companies that already have revenue, already have uh, infrastructure, everything that they have, and yet still their hit rate is very low. And I wonder, um, what are they missing that's the case? Because again, already somebody's eating the dog food and they're making, and I kind of think it all revolves around revenue and connections. Like even if they're operationally inefficient, that can easily be fixed. But what can't be fixed is somebody willing to buy your product or service. And I wonder what kind of additional value they can bring besides questioning the leadership of the company they've invested in, their strategy or how they do things. I don't think it's a good, I don't think they collaborate well. I'm not saying across the board because obviously there are funds that have great successes like the Draper funds and some of the others that I guess are good collaborators or they wouldn't have these kind of returns. But something's clearly missing when you have such a low hit rate.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I do think that there's some venture capitalists that are super high value added and a lot that are less so. I think it also probably depends on the sector and the dynamics. Like for example, in some markets are like a winner take all or winner take most dynamic because of network effects, right? Like if you think about like Facebook a, a, a social network like Facebook that only had 10% of the users would not be that useful to people. Like users would just rather go to Facebook and where everybody is than to the other one, unless it's like a niche or something that's more specialized. And so if you have 10 kind of companies trying to become the Facebook, there's something that does, I think, structurally make sense about a low hit rate, right? Because then the winner becomes huge. But there's also, I think, whether it is medical devices or lots of other sectors where that's not true. And to your point, you in a lot of sectors, I think you should be able to continue to improve your process of building a company and finding the right product and market. So I agree with you.
In chapter three, integrating the learning zone and performance zone, learning while doing. How can people balance the pressure to deliver results with the need to take time for learning?
Yeah, so when I ask people, and I do lots of keynotes, and I ask what makes it challenging to engage in the learning zone, the the two biggest things that people talk about are one is time, right? This is so busy to get things done. Like, how can I make time for the learning zone? And the other one is something around fear, right? Like fear of making mistakes, fear of what other people might think. And so what do we do about time? We have so much on our to-do list that we might just feel like we just have to get through it. We can't focus about improvement. We can't think about learning. And so I think the biggest opportunity is not to like engage in learning like going to a class, even though that's like time devoted and blocked for learning is super super valuable, but a lot of people don't find it to be feasible because they are so busy. And so the biggest opportunity, and because we spend so much time working, is to embed learning into work, right? So that we can, even if it's like small new experiments and new ways of doing things, we can embed that into what we're already doing. We're, preparing a presentation and we might say like, hey, like, here's an idea for something that could work here with this group. Let me try it out. I've never tried it, but I think that it might work really well for this group. So let me try it, right? Um, and so this is what's learning while doing is working on what we need to get done, but also finding opportunities to experiment, to solicit feedback after the presentation, to do things that will help us learn as we do. The other thing for people who feel really busy is to start small but frequent. So start building habits that um, help you engage in the learning zone a little bit, but hopefully every day. And a very simple thing that anybody can do is just in your morning habit, like include reminding yourself of what one thing you're trying to improve, whether personally or professionally. So once you have that habit where every morning you review what that is, then you can become more conscious and look for more opportunities to do that throughout the day. What do you think? Does anything else come to your mind, Mark?
No, I think you captured that well.
Okay.
What are examples of professions or organizations that have successfully blended the two zones? Which ones that people see stand out to you?
Well, I mean, there's a ton, but the most visible ones, probably the best example of growth, might say, is Microsoft. The Satya Nadella, the CEO, was promoted to CEO in 2014, and the executive team decided that they wanted to transform their culture in several ways. And one of the central pillars was growth mindset and kind of learning, embedding learning into the organization. And That was an organization where there was a ton of competition and just silos, competing with each other. And one of the other kind of principles was one Microsoft, right? It's being one team and collaboration. Another principle was diversity and inclusion, um, because more diverse brains are smarter than one brain. They Purpose was another one. And so they've done a great job at transforming their culture. And it's like leaders modeling learning visibly. So, Satya Nadella, is standing or emailing the whole, employee base and talking about a mistake he made and what he learned from that mistake, and just as a reinforcement of what we want to be doing, right? We want to be experimenting. We want to be noticing our mistakes, talking about them with each other so if we can figure out what we can learn from them. And so that's one example. I mean, there's lots of
I think
other
that's a great
companies.
example, by the
Yeah,
way. I
yeah,
think he's done one of the best turnaround jobs, maybe in the last half century.
yeah.
Because when I was at Wharton and my students worked at Microsoft, they said that was the worst culture they ever could have been in. And they were spiraling out of control. That Steve Ballmer was not he's now a case study on what not to do as a CEO, just like the guy who ran GE into the ground. He's also a case study of all the things you can do wrong. But Steve Ballmer was even worse because his management style was to play people off against each other, and they ended up having, as my students told me, fiefdoms within there. There wasn't any kind of collaboration. And there was nobody talking about, oh my God, I want to work for Microsoft, like they talk about working for Apple or Tesla or whoever. And this guy turned it around in a few short years to where they're now back to where they once were. And people want to work for these guys. And there's people tell me when you talk to Microsoft now, you feel the whole company is in total harmony, that they're all working together for the common good of the company.
Yeah, it is incredible because it's such a big company. It was at the time when he became CEO, it was a 40-year-old company, super huge company, one of the biggest companies in the world. And so it was like a huge ship that is hard to like change, right?
Right.
But since then, they have transformed the culture. They have their revenues were, then the results were pretty stagnant for a long time before he became CEO. They
A
have trip
decade.
they have tripled their revenues a decade.
Yeah.
Now they have tripled their revenues. They have quadrupled their net income, and the stock price has gone up by a factor of 8. So it's just absolutely incredible. It's a fantastic story.
Yeah, I give him huge credit for doing it. And at the same time, we watch Tim Cook, and although they've got all kinds of money, there's actually been zero innovation done at Apple since Steve Jobs died. I mean, you wonder what is wrong with the culture that they can't recruit somebody to be the product visionary while Tim Cook remains the operator. Because again, they're now a case study in how they've survived and continue to make money without literally creating anything new in over a decade.
Yeah, amazing.
Um, what mind shift, what mindset shifts are most critical for employees who feel they don't have the time to learn while they're performing?
Well, I think kind of starting with micro habits, right? Things that are easy. First of all, like there's the question and the self reflection of, do I want more learning in my life? Do I think that, learning habits would be useful to me professionally and personally, and grappling with that question. And if the answer is yes, right, then you can start going into a journey of like, okay, how do I make that happen? Um, but then if you do want to make it happen, then I would say starting small, starting with things that are easy to do in the learning zone, with things that are important to you. So thinking about, what do I want to improve? Why is that important to me? And what is a small habit that I can build that is ideally a daily habit that I can work on? May also think about who can help me, right? Who can support me? Who can be someone that can give me feedback along the way or ideas for how I can improve at this. And that would be fantastic if you do find someone in your life for that.
Of the six learning strategies you talk about in chapter four, you outline, which do you believe is most underused in the workplace today? And maybe you could just tell them quickly what those strategies are.
Yes. So I would say the learning zone strategy that there's a ton, right? But the one that I think is the biggest opportunity in the workplace is feedback, and specifically soliciting feedback. A lot of organizations and leaders that want to promote feedback focus on giving feedback, and that's fine. But actually, if you focus the culture on having everybody solicit feedback, starting with a leader, then it makes it a lot easier for people to receive feedback. It makes it a lot easier for people to give feedback and for people to be sharing with each other what they're observing. And the reason is we're social animals. We're trying to make an impact on our customers. So that's a social impact. We are doing that in collaboration with the people we work with. And there's always opportunities to learn about our impact on others. What's helpful, what's not helpful, what we might consider doing differently. And so the most underutilized and the most powerful learning zone strategy, I believe, is soliciting feedback. Now, in terms of because there's a ton of learning zone strategies, and in that chapter, I explore six of them. So one of them is deliberate practice, which is kind of more applicable to something like, for example, a sport or something where there's a very specific skill that we can work on. But that's when we might spend, 30 minutes, practicing a particular technique of the violin or a particular technique of a ballet or something like that. And there's some kind of qualities as to what deliberate practice looks like. But it takes a lot of mental effort, and so you do it for a half hour, an hour and a half, but not all day. Um, Number two is experimenting, and in particularly, sometimes we or organizations focus on we think we're going to experiment, but we experiment by experimenting with a big experiment, right? That costs a lot of money, that's going to take a lot of time, and we make the mistake of thinking that the experiment is a way to grow or to perform, right? And rather than seeing the experiment as let's experiment with something small to learn something so that we can become smarter. And once we are a lot smarter, then we can scale, then we can go big. So that's experimentation. In general, there's related to that is kind of seeking to work smarter rather than just harder. So thinking about, especially in teams, like regularly talking about how are we working together, what is helpful about how we're working together, what is causing challenges, and how can we continue to improve over time. So debriefs meetings are a way to do that. Self-reflection is a way to do that. Um, then there's the strategy of developing what I'm calling the air sense, which is the knowledge that we have in our brain. In the age of AI, and even before that, the internet, we people might think that knowing things is less important because we can just ask AI or we can just look it up in the internet. And the issue, and that's true. I mean, I use AI all the time. I use the internet all the time, but there's so much value in developing knowledge in our brain, because then our brain can make those connections, and we can also bring up the relevant knowledge when we are in conversation or we're trying to ideate or we're working on a problem. So what we were talking about before in terms of how am I developing my knowledge? Is it as an expert? Is it as a generalist? Is it something else? Is something to think about. Um, and then there's the general idea of the learning zone, the performance zone, right? Is that we don't want, and also like so the fifth strategy is like don't bulldoze, which means it's not that you're just going to take one strategy and use it all the time. Like you're just going to experiment all day, or you're going to do deliberate practice all day, or you're going to perform all day, or you're going to play all day. But we need to actually figure out what our days should look like, right? How do we harmonize the different things that we do during our day in order to like rest and to explore and to focus on execution. And it's kind of the harmony of these things working together that helps us learn and perform better, not just one thing, doing it as much as possible. And finally, there was The sixth one that I explore in this chapter is asking why. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we might want to focus on improving at something, and that might be the wrong thing to do. So, for example, if I am a manager and I lead a weekly meeting, I might focus on how do I improve my facilitation of that meeting. And if I just get too stuck on that, I might miss out on the opportunity to, hey, maybe a better, an even better way at some point is to have somebody else lead the meeting, right? And so one way to get out of that is to ask, like, why am I trying to do this? What is the higher purpose? So it might be like having effective meetings. And why is that? Well, having effective teams. And then if we ask the question of, like, okay, how do we get better at those higher level goals? Then we might come up with other solutions that we wouldn't see otherwise. So asking why is really important.
How can individuals embed deliberate practice into their daily routines without formal training and programs?
Well, so deliberate practice is something that not necessarily everybody needs to engage in. Deliberate practice is applicable to, so deliberate practice is when we are practicing a very narrow skill for repeatedly, and in between repetitions we are getting feedback, adjusting, and trying again. And ideally we're doing that with a coach who is giving us feedback and giving us ideas about what to adjust. And so, for example, you're wearing a NFL Halloween costume today. Something that quarterbacks might do in deliberate practice is use virtual reality headsets where, with their coach next to them, and they're holding a ball, they're holding their uniform, their helmet, and they see a whole play in 360 degrees, and they're moving and they're throwing the ball, which is going into a net. And so then they run a play, right? The coach and the quarterback then play the play again in slow motion, and the coach might ask the quarterback, hey, like, what did you notice? What did you not notice, that you're noticing now? How do you make this decision? And so then they might run the play again, right? And the quarterback might adjust, and then they might do that again, and they might adjust what they're doing in between repetitions. And that might be a way that they're working on the skill of noticing and figuring out what to pay attention to. Um, and so that's something that is very applicable to certain skills. It might be like, the performing arts, sports. It might also be in the workplace, like if you are giving a presentation and you're trying to, improve the way that you start the presentation, you might practice that and see yourself in video and notice something to adjust and try again, or with a coach, get feedback and try again. That would be deliberate practice. And it's not that complicated. That's what it is. I think anybody can do it, but it takes a lot of time. And it might not be the most important thing for everybody to do, but it's something to consider if you want to get better at a particular technical skill.
Unleashing the power of mistakes. And I encourage my students, now's the time to take these risks before they're detrimental to what you're doing. And you want to be part of organizations that encourage taking risks and you learn from it. So you emphasize learning from mistakes. How can leaders model this without eroding confidence in their own competence?
Well, a couple of things. First, we sometimes might think of mistakes as both good and bad, right? Like bad because they decrease performance, good because they're opportunities for learning. And that might lead people a bit confused about what to do about mistakes. And so I think it's helpful to distinguish mistakes that I call stretch mistakes, which we do in the learning zone, where we're trying something new and we know that things might not work well. With kind of high stakes mistakes, which are mistakes that could bring our career down or our company down or could create a lot of physical harm. And we want to try to avoid those high stakes mistakes by being in the performance zone. We want to try to make more stretch mistakes by experimenting and going into the learning zone. So getting clear. Then there's also the aha moment mistakes and the stretch mistake and the sloppy mistakes, so we can unpack a little bit what kinds of mistakes and errors do we want to do more of in what situations, and how do we go about them, both for ourselves and then, with each other, so we're on the same page. And for leaders, sometimes leaders are hesitant to behave like learners because they feel like what will give people confidence that they're in a great organization and under great leadership is someone who knows the answers. And sometimes leaders feel like, as a leader, I need to be sure of myself that I know what's the way and I'm sure. But the problem with that is that if we do that, other people will start doing that too. And then we won't share our uncertainties. We won't be trying with experimentation and like talking about mistakes so that we can learn from those mistakes, because we don't learn from mistakes. We learn from reflecting on mistakes. And so leaders can model being learners while being confident by teaching the organization that actually these learning zone behaviors are the way to success. This is the way that we're going to be successful, is this process, and so then they can show up as learners, they can solicit feedback, they can share what they're learning about, and reminding people that this is what we want to do more of, because this is a way that we succeed in a complex and fast changing world.
Yeah, I talk about all the mistakes I've made to my students. I'm totally open everything and what I learned from those mistakes. So I think sharing those times where things didn't turn out right actually helps an organization grow more, because you never really understand why you're successful, but you definitely want to know why something didn't work out, and you spend a lot of time reflecting on that.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
What distinguishes a productive mistake from a careless mistake?
Yeah, so we all can relate to sloppy mistakes, right? Where we have learned this before, we know better, and yet we make this mistake. And sometimes it's no big deal. We can laugh about it. We can use it as an opportunity to bring humor into our lives. And sometimes we really want to avoid this in the future. And so then it's always, any mistake is an opportunity to learn if we reflect on it and we think about, how do we change our system, our environment, our process, our checklist, so that we avoid this mistake in the future. And I would just add that sloppy mistakes, be careful about weaponizing them. Like it's when we assume that somebody else's mistake was a sloppy mistake and we kind of like blame them, uh, that can lead into trouble, because they might see it as an aha moment mistake or as a stretch mistake, or and it might then create fear in them to try new things and to experiment, or to share the mistakes when they do make the mistakes. So when others make mistakes, we want to stay curious and ask, hey, like, what do you think? What are you learning from this? What is your conclusion? And help them reflect so that they can figure out what to do differently going forward.
Which misconception about learning do you find more persuasive, even among educators or executives? What's misconceptions?
I mean, one big one we've talked about is just that you learn just by doing something, that you'll get better at it. So that's one that we've been talking about that is big. Another one is that if we just tell people, they learn. Like we learn by transmitting what's in our brain to somebody else's brain. But learning really involves, in some cases, experimentation and experience, in some cases reflection, certainly reflection, and for people to generate kind of their own insights rather than just hear them from other people. So that's another one. How about you? What do you find is a misconception about learning that you run across?
I think I find that the misconception about learning is that, especially in an academic area, that a lot of this research that they do that in the business community, if they haven't experienced it themselves, the information that they share is often inaccurate.
Mm,
uh, that a lot of the research that they do, I once asked my boss, how much of these research papers are really worth sharing with the business community at large? And he said 1%.
mm,
And when you do talk to people who haven't spent any time in the business world, I think it's an enormous mistake that they're not giving accurate information. And yet people will always say, oh, when you go take classes at school, you want to make sure that you don't get the adjuncts, that you get the full-time professors. But I find it's just the reverse, that the adjuncts have all the experience and the full-time faculty don't have a lot of experience. There may be great researchers and even great teachers for taking what's in there. But I think that that's always a big misconception.
Yeah, that resonates.
Why do you think people tend to overestimate how much they learn through experience alone?
Well, we haven't, been taught that to learn we need to be deliberate about improvement and to reflect, right? So people might not know that we don't learn from mistakes. We learn from reflecting on mistakes. We don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on mistakes, on experience. So, professional sports teams will play a match and have an experience, but then afterwards they'll watch a video and they'll discuss what went well and what didn't, and what happened in this play and what could we do differently. And it's that reflection that leads to learning, but a lot of us haven't been taught that before.
Um, which of the five elements in growth propeller, and you have to explain this, is hardest for individuals to maintain consistently?
Yeah, it's the growth propeller is a framework that helps us think about how we are living our lives and how we are fostering both learning and performance as well as other things. And one of the elements there is probably the two hardest things are, one is beliefs. What are our beliefs about different things? And the other one is what are habits? And I think beliefs and habits both take time to evolve, and we evolve them throughout life. I mean, the objective of all this is not to end up in some destination, but to always continue to evolve and change ourselves throughout our lives. And as part of that, evolve our beliefs and question our beliefs and expose ourselves to different ways of thinking, and continue to shift our habits. And that's just a process that takes time.
What is the most misunderstood aspect of what it means to be a true learning organization?
I mean, maybe it's that learning is detracting from performance, right? That we don't have time to learn because we have a lot to do and results to achieve. Because learning has a bad rap. Because in school, in my experience, and I think in a lot of people's experiences, I learned a lot of things that were not very useful and were not
Yeah.
relevant, and I was not interested in. And so the word learning seems to, has a bad rap. It seems to be something that's irrelevant and useless, and rather, so people think we don't have time for that, and that's not important.
How can a leader help a team re-enter the learning zone after a period of burnout or intense deadlines?
Yeah, I mean, well, rest is important, right? We need, in order to, like, sleep is, people who perform at the highest level sleep more than others. So definitely resting is important, and just figuring out what's the cadence, what is the margin that we need, what is the different habits and structures that we need to have these two zones in harmony. And sometimes we might over index on the performance zone and have a cramming period and just focus on performance, and that's fine. But over time, are we harmonizing these two zones? And that's something to figure out together.
The time went too fast. I say that every week. Everybody who listens to this show always will probably mock me for this, but the time does go too fast. It was great conversation. You have a terrific book, and it's a book that you read it and you have to reflect on what you've read. It's not a how-to book that you just act on. It requires you taking time and shutting everything else out so you can give some reflection to what you've just learned. So I thought it was terrific, and I thank you for doing it. And I hope maybe someday you'll come and visit us in Vietnam so I can have you talk to our classes.
I would love that. It's great to be in conversation with you, Mark. Thanks for all you do. Look forward to next time.
My pleasure. Everyone, have a wonderful weekend. We'll look forward to seeing you next Friday. Take care, everyone.